The words hung in the air like exhaust fumes, acrid and lingering. "No room in the car for your walker, Grandma." I stood at the curb, my hand still gripping the aluminum frame that had carried me through 3 years of unsteady mornings and careful afternoons. The trunk of their sedan gaped open, revealing golf clubs, a cooler, and shopping bags from the outlet mall. Everything essential, apparently, except the thing that kept me upright. "But I began, then stopped. The neighbors across the street were watering their marigolds, heads turned just enough to catch the scene without seeming to stare. "Mrs. Chen's hose paused mid-arc. The Hendersons' curtain twitched. "We talked about this," my daughter-in-law said, not unkindly but with the practiced patience of someone explaining something to a child. "The trunk is packed. We can't fit everything." My son, my David, who I'd driven to soccer practice and piano lessons and emergency room visits when he split his chin on the monkey bars, shifted his weight from foot to foot. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The keys jingled in his hand like loose change. "I could hold it in my lap," I offered, though we all knew the walker wouldn't fold small enough, wouldn't disappear into something manageable and unobtrusive. "Mom." "Just that." "Mom." The way you'd say it to stop a conversation that had already gone too far. The car door slammed with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished writing. Through the rain-spotted window, I watched them drive away, their brake lights blinking red at the stop sign before disappearing around the corner toward the restaurant where they'd celebrate David's promotion without me. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the walker in my hands, the weight of the neighbors careful not looking, and the weight of dignity settling heavy as luggage I couldn't lift anymore. Sometimes dignity is heavier than luggage. The rain began to fall in earnest then, each drop a small percussion against the sidewalk, against my coat, against the aluminum frame that suddenly felt less like support and more like evidence of everything I'd become in their eyes. I turned toward my front door, each step deliberate and measured, the walker's rubber feet finding purchase on the wet concrete. Behind me, the street grew quiet except for the rain. But this story isn't about that moment at the curb, not really. It's about what happened 10 days later, when I opened a different trunk entirely. 10 days. Long enough for the sting to settle into something quieter, more purposeful. Long enough to sign papers that mattered, to share tea with people who understood the weight of aluminum frames and the lightness of genuine laughter. Long enough to remember that there are many vehicles in this world, and not all of them have 4 wheels. In 10 days, I would discover that my walker fit perfectly well in a trunk, just not the one they'd measured it against. I would learn the satisfying click of a pen, signing my own name on documents that belonged to me. I would taste tea that didn't tremble in the cup because the hands holding it had found their steadiness again. There is more than one vehicle to carry me. The marigolds across the street would still be blooming, Mrs. Chen would still be watering them with the same careful attention, but the woman watching from this side of the street would be different. Not bitter, not broken, but rearranged. Like furniture moved to catch better light. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, there was the morning after, when the kettle's whistle seemed to echo the sound of that car door slamming, and I had to decide what to do with the echo. I woke the next morning to the sound of my own breathing, steady and unremarkable in the quiet house. The walker stood beside my bed like a faithful dog, waiting. Outside, the world continued its business, garbage trucks rumbling, coffee brewing in kitchens up and down the street, children being buckled into car seats for the drive to school. My hand shook as I made my tea, not from age or infirmity, but from something deeper. The tremor of a person who had been measured and found wanting, who had been weighed against golf clubs and shopping bags and deemed less essential. I sat at my kitchen table with the steam rising from my cup, and I remembered. I remembered driving David to his first day of kindergarten and how he'd cried and clung to my leg until I promised to wait in the car until he was ready. I'd sat in that parking lot for 2 hours, engine running, ready to rescue him if he needed rescuing. I remembered the late-night drives to the emergency room when he had pneumonia, when Sarah had her appendix out, and when the baby ran a fever that wouldn't break. I remembered loading car after car with birthday presents, Christmas gifts, groceries when money was tight, and furniture when they moved to their first apartment. I remembered being the one with room in my trunk, room in my schedule, and room in my heart for whatever they needed carrying. The bread crust from yesterday's dinner sat on my plate, forgotten. I broke it into small pieces, watching the crumbs scatter across the blue ceramic like tiny islands. Each piece seemed to hold a memory, the birthday cakes I'd baked, the lunches I'd packed, and the dinners I'd cooked when they were too tired or too busy or too overwhelmed to feed themselves. Not anger. Not an apology. Something quieter. The kettle whistled again. I'd forgotten I'd put it back on the stove. The sound cut through the morning air like a decision being made, sharp and clear and impossible to ignore. I turned off the burner and stood there for a moment, my hand on the handle, feeling the heat rise between my fingers. Something was germinating in the space between memory and possibility, between what I'd given and what I'd been given in return. Not resentment, exactly, but a kind of clarity that felt like morning light after a long night of rain. I poured the second cup of tea and carried it to the window, where I could see Mrs. Chen's marigolds nodding in the breeze, bright and unapologetic in their blooming. By afternoon, I had found a yellow legal pad in the drawer where I kept the important papers, birth certificates, insurance policies, and the deed to the house. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen that wrote smoothly, without the scratching hesitation of cheap ballpoints, and I began to write. Things I no longer owe. The title came first, clear and definitive across the top of the page. Then, in my careful handwriting, the list began to unfold, rides to restaurants that don't accommodate walkers. Apologies for taking up space. Gratitude for being included in plans that exclude my needs. Silence when my dignity is treated as optional. Each line felt like a small liberation, a door being unlocked from the inside. I wrote slowly, deliberately, tasting each word before committing it to paper. The pen moved across the yellow surface like a key turning in a lock I'd forgotten I held. Pretending my limitations are character flaws. Making myself smaller to fit in spaces not designed for me. Accepting no room as the final word. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes that danced above my paper like tiny witnesses to this quiet revolution. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, the distant hum of traffic, and the ordinary sounds of a world that continued to turn while I sat here, rewriting the terms of my place in it. I called the bank. The phone rang twice before a pleasant voice answered, and I asked about account verification procedures, about trust documents, and about the simple mechanics of ensuring my signature meant what I intended it to mean. The woman on the other end was patient and professional, treating my questions as legitimate rather than burdensome. A list is a map when the world calls you lost. When I hung up the phone, I looked down at my yellow paper, at the neat lines of text that had transformed from grievances into something more powerful, a blueprint. Not for revenge, but for reconstruction. Not for punishment, but for the careful, deliberate act of building a life that fits me properly. I folded the paper once, twice, and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, where it rested against my ribs like a secret worth keeping. The pen went back in the drawer, next to the important papers that were about to become more important than they'd ever been. 3 days later, I stood in my driveway with my car keys in one hand and my walker in the other, studying the geometry of possibility. My car, a modest sedan I'd owned for 6 years, waited with its trunk open like a question mark against the morning sky. The walker, aluminum and practical, stood beside me with its familiar weight and angles. For a moment, I simply looked at both of them, these two essential tools of my independence, and wondered why I'd never tried this particular equation before. I approached the problem like a puzzle rather than a defeat. The walker folded, yes, but not in the way I'd been folding it. I discovered that if I collapsed it differently, if I angled it just so, if I thought of the trunk space not as a rigid container but as a flexible possibility, everything changed. The walker slid into the trunk with room to spare. Not just room, but space for a small grocery bag, for my purse, for the dignity of knowing I could transport myself and my needs without negotiation or compromise. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the scent of the lilac bush that bloomed beside my driveway, feeling something shift in my chest. Not triumph, exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that tasted like morning coffee and sounded like a door opening instead of closing. It fit, after all. Always had. I drove myself to the library that morning, parked in the handicapped space without apology, and unloaded my walker with the practiced efficiency of someone who had solved a problem rather than surrendered to one. The librarian smiled when I approached the circulation desk, and I realized it had been weeks since someone had looked at me without that careful, pitying expression I'd grown accustomed to seeing. The drive home was different, too. Not just because I was behind the wheel instead of being a passenger in someone else's plans, but because the car felt like mine again. The radio played songs I chose, the air conditioning was set to my preference, and the walker in the trunk was evidence of capability rather than limitation. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before getting out, watching the lilacs sway in the breeze, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Through my windshield, I could see Mrs. Chin was watering her marigolds, and when she waved, I waved back with the confidence of someone who had just proven something important to herself. The trunk closed with a satisfying click, and I walked to my front door with my walker steady beneath my hands and my keys jingling with the sound of solutions found. The bank smelled like fresh coffee and the particular kind of quiet that comes with serious business conducted in hushed tones. I approached the customer service counter with my folder of documents, my list of questions, and the calm certainty of someone who had done her homework. "I'd like to review my trust documents," I told the young man behind the counter, "and make some adjustments to my account access." He was professional and courteous, treating my request as routine rather than remarkable. We sat in a small office with glass walls, and he spread my papers across the desk like a map of my financial life. Account statements, beneficiary forms, and the trust documents I'd signed years ago when David had insisted I get my affairs in order. Fictional narrative. Not legal/financial advice. "These signatures here," the banker said, pointing to lines I'd signed without fully understanding their implications, "give your son power of attorney over these accounts." "Is that still your intention?" I studied the papers, the careful legal language that had seemed so necessary when David had explained it, so prudent and responsible. Now, in the fluorescent light of the bank office, it looked different. Not wrong, exactly, but incomplete. Like a story told from only one perspective. "I'd like to modify that," I said. "I want to maintain primary control while I'm capable of making my own decisions." The banker nodded, making notes on a yellow pad. "We can certainly arrange that. You'll need to sign new documents, but it's a straightforward process." We spent an hour reviewing options, discussing beneficiaries, and talking about the mechanics of financial independence. I mentioned my grandchild, David's daughter, and how I wanted to ensure her education fund remained intact regardless of other family dynamics. The banker took notes, asked clarifying questions, and treated my concerns as legitimate and my decisions as my own to make. Ink can be a boundary, too. When I left the bank, I carried new signature cards, updated account information, and the quiet satisfaction of having reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd given away. The papers rustled in my folder as I walked to my car, each page a small declaration of autonomy. I loaded my walker into the trunk with the practiced ease of someone who had solved that particular puzzle and drove home through streets that seemed somehow more navigable than they had been a week ago. They came on Thursday evening, unannounced but not unexpected. I heard David's key in the lock. I'd given him that key for emergencies, though apparently my financial independence qualified as one, and the sound of 2 sets of footsteps crossing my hardwood floors. I was at the kitchen table, eating a simple dinner of soup and bread, when they appeared in the doorway. David looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight like he had as a child when he'd been caught in some minor transgression. His wife stood beside him with her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested strong opinions held in check. "Mom," David said, settling into the chair across from me. "We need to talk." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the kitchen window. I took another spoonful of soup, chewed my bread slowly, and waited. The bank called, his wife said, apparently deciding that directness was the better strategy. They said you'd made changes to your accounts. We're concerned. I set down my spoon and looked at them both, these people I loved, who loved me, who had somehow convinced themselves that love meant making decisions for me rather than with me. Concerned about what, exactly? About your judgment, David said, and I could hear the echo of conversations they'd had about me, discussions of my capacity, my reliability, and my fitness to manage my own affairs. You're not thinking clearly. This whole thing with the car, with the walker, what about the walker? You know what I mean. You're being stubborn. Unreasonable. The rain picked up, drumming against the window with increasing intensity. I broke off another piece of bread, feeling the crust crumble between my fingers. Your volume does not move my signature, I said quietly. They exchanged glances, the kind of look that passes between people who have discussed someone's mental state and reached conclusions about it. We're trying to help you, his wife said, her voice taking on that tone I'd heard her use with their daughter when she was being particularly difficult. We're trying to protect you from making mistakes. Mistakes like maintaining control over my own money? Like driving my own car? Like expecting my mobility aid to be accommodated when we go places together? That's not what this is about, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what is it about? The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and the lights flickered briefly. In that moment of uncertain illumination, I saw them clearly, two people who had grown comfortable with my dependence, who had mistaken my gratitude for their help with permission to make my choices for me. It's about family, his wife said finally. It's about trust. I nodded slowly, understanding at last the fundamental disagreement we were having. You're right. It is about trust. And I'm learning to trust myself again. They left shortly after that, David's key conspicuously absent from his keychain when they walked out into the rain. I finished my soup in the quiet kitchen, listening to the storm pass over my house like a conversation I didn't need to join. Not revenge. Repair. The rain was still falling the next morning when Mrs. Chen appeared at my door with a large black umbrella and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. I'm going to the farmer's market, she said without preamble. Would you like to come? I have plenty of room in my car. I looked past her to the sedan in my driveway, then at the walker standing ready by my front door. I should probably drive myself, nonsense, she said, but not in the dismissive way I'd grown accustomed to. It's pouring, and I could use the company. Besides, I want to show you the marigold vendor. She has varieties I've never seen before. Something in her tone, the assumption that I might have opinions about marigolds, that my company was desired rather than tolerated, made me reach for my coat. Her car was a small SUV with a spacious trunk that swallowed my walker without hesitation or comment. She didn't make a production of it, didn't congratulate herself on her accommodation, or point out how much room there was. She simply opened the trunk, waited while I positioned the walker, and closed it again with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom accessibility was a given rather than a favor. Some trunks open without measuring. We drove through the rain-washed streets with the radio playing softly, talking about the weather, about the market vendors, and about the particular satisfaction of choosing your own vegetables rather than accepting whatever someone else deemed suitable. Mrs. Chen had been widowed for 3 years, she told me, and had learned the art of making a life that fit her exactly rather than apologizing for the space she took up in the world. At the market, she introduced me to the marigold vendor, a woman about my age with soil under her fingernails and an encyclopedic knowledge of flower varieties. We spent 20 minutes discussing the merits of different cultivars, the woman treating my questions about bloom times and soil preferences as legitimate expertise rather than idle curiosity. I bought a flat of French marigolds, bright orange blooms that would complement the yellow ones Mrs. Chen favored. The vendor helped me load them into Mrs. Chen's car, arranging them carefully around my walker with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that everything had its place if you just thought about the geometry properly. On the drive home, Mrs. Chen and I planned where I might plant the marigolds, along the front walk, perhaps, or in the bed beside my driveway where they'd catch the morning sun. The rain had stopped, and shafts of sunlight were breaking through the clouds, illuminating the wet streets like a promise of better weather ahead. When we pulled into my driveway, Mrs. Chen helped me unload the flowers and my walker, but she didn't hover or fuss. She simply handed me the flat of marigolds and said, "These will look lovely here. I'll be able to see them from my kitchen window." I stood in my driveway after she'd driven away, holding the flowers and feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, the simple pleasure of being included without conditions, of having my needs met without negotiation, of being treated as someone whose presence added value rather than complications. The marigolds would need planting, but first I wanted to sit with this feeling for a moment, this reminder that the world contained people who opened their trunks without measuring first, who offered umbrellas without keeping score, who understood that dignity was not a luxury but a basic requirement for any journey worth taking. The call came on Monday morning while I was having my coffee and planning where to plant the marigolds. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to someone from the Historical Society who had gotten my name from the library volunteer coordinator. "We're looking for someone to help organize our archives," she said. "It's part-time work, mostly filing and cataloging. The pay isn't much, but it's quiet work, and you'd be helping preserve local history." I found myself saying yes before I'd fully considered the implications. Yes to the work, yes to the schedule, and yes to the idea that I might have something to contribute beyond my willingness to be accommodated by others. The Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house downtown, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. My supervisor, a woman named Margaret with silver hair and practical shoes, showed me to a desk in a room lined with filing cabinets and bankers' boxes full of documents waiting to be sorted. "Most of this is correspondence from the 1940s and 50s, she explained, opening a box to reveal neat stacks of letters tied with ribbon. "We need them organized by date and subject and then entered into our database. It's detail work, but important. These letters tell the story of how this town grew and changed." I settled into the work with surprising ease. The letters were fascinating, accounts of daily life during wartime, discussions of town planning, complaints about road conditions, and celebrations of new businesses opening. Each document was a small window into lives lived with the same mixture of hope and worry, joy and frustration that characterized my own experience. The room was cool and quiet, with only the sound of papers rustling and the occasional creak of the old house settling around us. Dust motes danced in the lamplight, and I found myself thinking about the people who had written these letters, who had taken the time to put their thoughts on paper, to create a record of their existence that would outlast them. What they call past, I call employable. My walker stood beside my desk like a faithful assistant, holding my purse and the small lunch I'd packed. Margaret had positioned my workspace near the window, where I could look out at the street and watch the ordinary business of the town unfold, people walking to work, children riding bicycles, delivery trucks making their rounds. At the end of my first week, Margaret handed me a paycheck with my name printed clearly across the top. It wasn't a large amount, but it was mine, earned through my own effort and attention to detail. I deposited it at the bank where I'd recently reclaimed control of my accounts, and the teller smiled when she processed the transaction. "Starting a new job?" she asked, and I realized that yes, I was. Not just the filing work, but the larger project of building a life that belonged to me, that reflected my choices rather than other people's assumptions about my limitations. I drove home through streets that seemed more familiar now that I was navigating them regularly, my walker secure in the trunk, my paycheck in my purse, and the satisfaction of useful work settling into my bones like a reminder of who I'd always been underneath the careful accommodations and apologetic gratitude. On Sunday evening, I sat at my kitchen table with good paper, a fountain pen that wrote smoothly, and the weight of decisions that belonged entirely to me. The house was quiet except for the tick of the clock on the mantel and the distant sound of Mrs. Chen's television through the thin walls between our properties. I had spent the week thinking about legacy, about the difference between what we leave behind and what we choose to pass on. The letters at the Historical Society had taught me something about the power of documentation, about the importance of making your intentions clear in writing that would outlast the conversations and assumptions that surrounded them. Fictional narrative. Not legal/financial advice. The letter I wrote was not angry or vindictive. It was simply clear. I outlined my wishes for my estate, my intentions for the trust fund I'd established for my granddaughter, and my decisions about charitable donations that reflected my values rather than anyone else's expectations. I wrote about the house, about my car, and about the small but meaningful accumulation of a life lived with attention to detail and care for others. I wrote about the marigolds I'd planted along the front walk and how they'd need watering and deadheading to bloom properly through the summer. I wrote about the Historical Society work, about the satisfaction of organizing other people's stories, and about the hope that someone might someday organize mine with the same careful attention. Most importantly, I wrote about choice. About the difference between being cared for and being controlled, between accepting help and surrendering agency, and between gratitude and obligation. I wrote about trunks that opened without measuring, about the geometry of dignity, and about the simple revolutionary act of taking up exactly the space you needed without apology. I do not pass on silence, I pass on choice. When the letter was finished, I read it through twice, checking for clarity, for completeness, and for the tone I wanted to strike, firm but not harsh, decisive but not cruel. I folded it carefully and slipped it into an envelope that I sealed with wax, pressing my initial into the warm red surface with a stamp that had belonged to my mother. I hung my keys back on the hook by the front door, where they belonged, where they would stay until I decided otherwise. My walker stood nearby, ready for tomorrow's journey to the Historical Society, to the grocery store, to wherever I decided I needed to go. The envelope went into the safe with my other important papers, next to the updated bank documents and the new will I'd had drawn up by a lawyer who had treated my requests as reasonable rather than remarkable. Everything in its place, everything documented, everything clear. Outside, the marigolds nodded in the evening breeze, bright and unapologetic in their blooming, taking up exactly the space they needed to flourish. This morning, I sit at my kitchen table with my tea steaming in the cup, a slice of bread with butter melting into its crust, and the rain pattering against the window like a gentle conversation I don't need to join. My walker stands beside me, steady and reliable, and through the glass I can see my car in the driveway, its trunk closed but ready. 10 days have passed since that moment at the curb, since the words that hung in the air like exhaust fumes, since the sound of a car door closing on a conversation I hadn't finished. 10 days since I stood on the sidewalk feeling the weight of dignity settling heavy as luggage I couldn't lift. But I was wrong about that weight. Dignity isn't heavy at all. It's the lightest thing in the world when you stop trying to carry it in someone else's trunk. The marigolds along my front walk are blooming now, bright orange faces turned toward the morning sun. Mrs. Chen waves from her kitchen window, and I wave back with the confidence of someone who has learned the difference between being accommodated and being welcomed, between taking up space and claiming it. My work at the Historical Society continues, each day bringing new letters to sort and new stories to preserve. Yesterday, I found a correspondence between two sisters separated by the war, their words carrying across distance and time with the same careful attention to detail that I bring to my own documentation now. One sister wrote to the other, "I am learning that there are many ways to come home, and not all of them require the same vehicle." The envelope in my safe holds my intentions, clear and documented. The bank holds my accounts, properly arranged. The trunk of my car holds my walker, angled just right, fitting perfectly in the space that was always there, waiting for me to measure it properly. It was never the trunk that was too small. I finish my tea and prepare for another day of work, of choices made without apology, of space claimed rather than granted. The rain continues its gentle percussion against the window, and I listen to it like music, Like the sound of a world that has room for all of us if we just think about the geometry properly. My keys jingle as I pick them up from their hook, and the sound is bright and clear, like a door opening instead of closing, like a conversation that's just beginning instead of one that's already ended. The walker and I step out into the morning together, ready for whatever journey comes next, secure in the knowledge that we fit perfectly in the vehicle that matters most, the life I built to carry us both with dignity intact and space enough for everything that truly belongs.